Bikini Bottom is standing on its downfall. Residents are screaming, and the spark has faded away. Why? Because SpongeBob was never born. Patrick never becomes the dumb, happy star he is. And while you might think that SpongeBob would easily be replaced by the other fry cook who could joke around, his ties with the Bikini Bottom timeline are much deeper, depending on how you look at it. Without him, Plankton is seen as the biggest threat, but the residents don't know that there is one character which poses much more chaos. At 124 Conch Street, an empty pineapple house slowly decays, its windows dark and lifeless. The ocean floor feels a little too quiet. You would think that Squidward's life would be much quieter now, but this piece comes at a cost. Squidward Tentacles sleeps peacefully, and under a nearby rock, Patrick Star remains in permanent hibernation, never having met the best friend who would have given his life purpose. However, the true impact of SpongeBob's absence reaches far beyond his neighborhood, and nowhere is this change more evident than at a certain restaurant in the heart of Bikini Bottom. Bikini Bottom doesn't know what it lost. Because SpongeBob never existed, no one misses him. No one wonders why the Krusty Krab's fry station is a revolving door of failures. No one questions why Bikini Bottom feels just a little off, like a joke with no punchline. Mr. Krabs, of course, feels it the most. The Krusty Krab is falling apart. It stands as a shadow of what it could have been. Not just in the "it's always been a little gross" kind of way, but in the financial disaster kind of way. Finding a decent fry cook has been impossible. Either they quit within a day, realizing the job is insanely demanding, or Mr. Krabs pushes them out with his extreme cost-cutting measures. Employees are expected to bring their own spatulas, work 16-hour shifts, and clean the grease traps with their bare hands. Mr. Krabs, once a shrewd but ultimately good-hearted businessman, now spends his days desperately trying to keep his failing restaurant afloat. Jim, the current fry cook, burns another batch of Krabby Patties. The smell of charred seafood wafts through the restaurant as frustrated customers walk out, never to return. Mr. Krabs winces at every squeak of the door, watching his profits literally walk away. His claws, once proudly polishing his first dollar, now nervously click against the cash register as he counts his dwindling daily earnings. So naturally, Mr. Krabs turns to his last remaining option, Squidward. In the original timeline, Squidward stayed at the Krusty Krab out of habit. He hated SpongeBob, but he hated change more. And as much as he complained, SpongeBob gave his life structure. Something to push against. Without him, Squidward suddenly realizes he doesn't have to be here. Why is he even working at the Krusty Krab? For money? No, he can barely afford rent as it is. For social interaction? Please. The only people he talks to are Mr. Krabs, who treats him like a cheap mop, and customers who don't even remember his name. So he does what he could never do in the real timeline. He quits. For real this time. No hesitation, no second guessing. He hands in his uniform, packs his clarinet, and leaves Bikini Bottom for good. Across the street, Plankton watches with growing satisfaction, but he doesn't make any move yet, because the Chum Bucket's neon signs now shine brighter than the Krusty Krab's faded boards. Not that Plankton's cooking has improved, but in a town with no alternatives, even mediocre food can attract customers. However, this is not the kind of success Plankton was hoping for, and he still has darker plans to grow his empire. But where is Pearl? Why doesn't she help her father? She might look smart and intelligent, but there's a reason she isn't there to help Mr. Krabs. And just like that, Mr. Krabs is completely alone. With no fry cook and no cashier, the Krusty Krab is doomed. For the first time in his life, Mr. Krabs faces true financial ruin. The restaurant that was once Bikini Bottom's most famous eatery is now a ghost town. But just when he thinks it can't get any worse, Plankton knocks on the door, and he's not here to steal the formula. He's here to buy it. For years, Plankton has tried everything to get the Krabby Patty secret formula. Giant robots, mind control, elaborate disguises, but none of it worked, because SpongeBob was always there to stop him. Not this time. This time, he doesn't need to steal anything. Because the Krusty Krab is already failing. And Mr. Krabs? He's more desperate than ever. At first, Mr. Krabs refuses. The very thought of selling the formula makes his shell curl. It's his legacy, his pride, his baby. But then Plankton lays out the numbers. The Krusty Krab's revenue is a disaster. The debt collectors are closing in. The only way out is to sell. And for the first time in his life, Mr. Krabs has no choice. He signs the deal, and just like that, Plankton wins. Partially. But this is just the beginning of the darkest chapter in Bikini Bottom's history. With the formula in hand, he doesn't just compete with the Krusty Krab, he owns the Krusty Krab. But then, the real betrayal happens, because the second Mr. Krabs hands over the recipe, Plankton kicks him out. No partnership, no joint business, nothing. The Krusty Krab is now a chumbucket enterprise, and Mr. Krabs is left with nothing. Mr. Krabs retreats to his anchor house, a broken crustacean, his entrepreneurial spirit crushed under the weight of failure. Pearl visits less and less often. She can't bear to see her father's dream crumbling. But what about Sandy? She is a great scientist and researcher. She would probably help Mr. Krabs, but in this timeline, she is not living in Bikini Bottom anymore. You will find out why later. However, we first need to talk about the character whose life is affected the most because of SpongeBob's absence. Patrick Star lives a life of true isolation. Without SpongeBob's friendship to draw him out into the world, he rarely leaves his home. Eventually, Patrick's parents make a difficult decision. During one of their rare visits, they find their son living in complete squalor. They convince him to return home with them to their own rock farm. Meanwhile, Bikini Bottom watches as Plankton industrializes the Krabby Patty. With Karen's AI technology and unlimited resources, Plankton turns the Krabby Patty into a mass-produced, citywide empire. But Bikini Bottom residents don't know that it will eventually lead to a war. Because Plankton isn't just running a restaurant anymore, he's running Bikini Bottom, and nobody realizes the true consequences. Not yet. There's no Sandy Cheeks to stop him, because the tree dome at the heart of Bikini Bottom was never built. Without SpongeBob's enthusiasm and friendship, Sandy Cheeks never found a compelling reason to establish her underwater research station in this particular stretch of the ocean. Meanwhile, Plankton is apparently making Bikini Bottom a better place to live in. He had spent years being a joke, and now, for the first time in his miserable existence, he was on top. With Karen's AI running the logistics, Plankton turned the Krabby Patty into a product that could be mass-produced, mass-marketed, and mass-consumed. The new Krabby Patty wasn't made with love or passion. It was made with efficiency, precise measurements, and scientific perfection. Bikini Bottom had never seen a fast food empire like this before. But again, the city was not seeing what Plankton was doing, as they were worried because of a much bigger issue. At first, the city embraced the change. Lines wrapped around the block at Plankton's new futuristic restaurants. The days of waiting for a distracted fry cook to slap together a meal were over. Every meal was identical, consistent, and served within seconds, just like McDonald's. The convenience was intoxicating. But something felt off. The food was perfect, but it wasn't satisfying. There was no warmth, no charm, no personality in the experience. The patties tasted hollow. Every bite was exactly the same, every flavor note calculated to be optimal, yet somehow it wasn't enough. But the real problem was Jellyfish. Without SpongeBob, no one was keeping the jellyfish population in check. For years, without realizing it, SpongeBob had been the one controlling their numbers through his constant jellyfishing trips. It had been a delicate balance, one no one had ever paid attention to. Without him, the jellyfish multiplied. Initially, it was a mild inconvenience. A few extra jellyfish buzzing around, some minor stings here and there, annoying but manageable. Then they started forming swarms, moving in clouds through the streets. The occasional zap became a constant threat. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. Entire districts of Bikini Bottom were overrun. Businesses shut down, unable to keep customers from being fried on their way to work. Houses were abandoned. The once thriving streets of Bikini Bottom were now ghostly pathways, filled only with the sound of crackling electricity and the distant hum of an approaching swarm. Plankton watched his empire crumble before his eyes. He had done it. He had taken over. He had beaten Mr. Krabs. He had finally won. And yet, he was left with nothing. Bikini Bottom was decaying, drowning in jellyfish and empty storefronts. He owned everything, but his empire was worthless. And that's when Squidward came back. When Squidward walked away from the Krusty Krab, he thought he had finally escaped. And somehow, he made it. In a more sophisticated city, his paintings caught the attention of critics. His name was whispered in galleries, his art displayed in elite exhibitions. It was everything he had ever wanted. He attended elegant parties where people in fine suits and gowns discussed abstract concepts over glasses of seafoam champagne. They praised his work, calling it revolutionary, evocative, a deep commentary on existential despair, and Squidward smiled, nodded, and pretended he felt the same way. But something was wrong. He had imagined this life for so long, but now that he had it, he couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Was this it? The conversations were shallow. The praise felt mechanical. For the first time in his life, he missed it. He missed the nonsensical adventures, the ridiculousness of everyday life in Bikini Bottom. But the moment he came back, he knew something was wrong. Bikini Bottom was lifeless. Squidward found himself standing in the ruins of what had once been his victory. The tiny villain who had spent his entire existence fighting for control of Bikini Bottom now stood at the top and looked miserable. Plankton had finally won, and it had cost him everything. And Squidward understood. They had both made the same mistake. Plankton had believed that power would bring him happiness. Squidward had believed that success would bring him peace. Neither of them had been right. Plankton had conquered Bikini Bottom, but in doing so had drained the soul from it. Squidward had escaped Bikini Bottom, but in doing so had drained the soul from himself. And now they both stood in the ruins of a place they had both failed in their own way. For a long moment, Squidward just stared at the crumbling city around him. Then he turned back to Plankton, took a deep breath, and said something neither of them ever thought he would say. "We have to fix this." Plankton scoffed at Squidward's words. "There's nothing left to fix." Squidward didn't argue. He just looked around at what used to be Bikini Bottom. The empty streets, the abandoned businesses, the dull, lifeless sky above. The town had become a wasteland, and Plankton, for all his supposed intelligence, had no idea how to bring it back. But Squidward did, because for the first time in his life, Squidward had the money, the influence, and the resources to actually do something. He poured his wealth into research teams that studied the jellyfish infestation. He built sanctuaries and hired staff to catch jellyfish. Within a few months, the constant threat of electrocution finally faded. And as the danger receded, the people of Bikini Bottom began to return. But Bikini Bottom had lost something deeper, its soul. Plankton would have never thought that Squidward would solve the biggest issue Bikini Bottom residents were facing. He feared that people will soon make Squidward their leader. Meanwhile, Squidward had already made up his mind to take control back from Plankton. With his fortune, he opened a new restaurant chain. Why a restaurant? Well, this was the only way to truly defeat Plankton. But Squidward didn't build soulless machines to replace workers. Instead, he hired professional chefs who prepared the food with love and passion, the two things that could bring back Bikini Bottom's true soul. Plankton panicked. He tried to smear Squidward's reputation, launching ad campaigns to discredit his business. He claimed efficiency was king, that tradition was outdated, that the future belonged to science, not sentiment. But deep down, he knew the truth. People were flocking back to Squidward's restaurants. Squidward was winning, but he felt alone because his only neighbor, Patrick, had left. He brought him back, and Squidward, in all his sophistication, tried to introduce Patrick to culture, art, music, refinement. Patrick, of course, was terrible at all of it. But somehow, Squidward enjoyed it, because for the first time, someone else was as terrible at art as he was at life. And Patrick finally had someone to talk to share meals with, to drag into ridiculous nonsense just because it was fun. And as Bikini Bottom healed, so did they. Squidward had found something he never expected to have, and yet even with all of this, there was an emptiness he couldn't explain. But what if something else changed? What if Patrick was never born? Or even worse, what if Mr. Krabs died? Let me know what our next what if scenario should be in the comments below. And until then, stay absorbent.